Between 1972 and 1974, 6 teenagers vanished from 6 different towns across 6 different states. No signs of struggle, no suspects, no confirmed connection, except one. At each site, hidden under floorboards, on crumbling brick, or etched into bedroom floors, investigators found the same thing. A spiral, drawn in chalk. Perfectly symmetrical. Perfectly unexplained. The cases were closed quietly. Local news stopped asking questions. Families were told it was coincidence. But internal FBI memos tell a different story. One of redacted pages, ritual symbolism, and a phrase found scrawled beneath one of the spirals. Vocati said non vocem habent. They are called, but have no voice. What you're about to hear is the most complete account ever compiled of what has come to be known as the chalk spiral case. A mystery that was never solved, because it was never meant to be understood. If you're new here, consider subscribing. And if you think this ends in resolution, in answers, in comfort, stay until the end. The spiral has no center. And once you enter it, you may not leave the same. Harlan, Kentucky, March 4, 1972. The town was still gripped by a stubborn winter. The trees stood bare, the ground was brittle and gray, and a chill crept through the narrow alleys and quiet neighborhoods like a forgotten hymn. On this particular evening, the sky was cloudless and dark, and the lights of Harlan Baptist Church glowed faintly in the distance. Inside, 17-year-old Benjamin Arnett was finishing choir practice. Benjamin was well known in Harlan, not because he sought attention, but precisely because he didn't. He was the kind of boy people remembered for his stillness. A quiet, observant presence. He lived with his mother, Lila Arnett, a reserved woman who worked nights at the town's library. Benjamin's father had died when he was 7. Since then, Lila and Benjamin lived in a modest home 3 blocks from the church. It was said that Benjamin inherited his mother's silence and his father's discipline. He had no siblings, few friends. But his voice, his singing voice, was striking. He had a clear, crystalline tenor that left a hush in every room. When he sang in the church's small choir, people listened. It wasn't just beautiful, it was haunting. The night of March 4th was unremarkable at first. Choir practice ended around 7:15 p.m., and most of the group had already left by 7:30. Mrs. Kendall, the choir director, had been struggling with a migraine and excused herself early, leaving Benjamin to put away the hymnals and close up. He often stayed late. He liked the acoustics of the chapel when it was empty. By 9 p.m., the church was dark. No one saw Benjamin leave. No one heard anything unusual. The next morning, March 5th, Lila Arnett woke at 6:30 a.m. and noticed Benjamin's bed was still made. At first, she assumed he had gotten up early. But the house was quiet. The kitchen untouched. The back door was still locked. Benjamin was gone. She called neighbors, friends, the church. No one had seen him. By 10 a.m., she called the police. Sheriff Harold Gaines arrived at the Arnett house by midday. A search was organized. Volunteers combed the streets, the woods behind the church, the creek beds and rail yards. Flyers were printed and pinned to telephone poles. But there were no signs. Not a shoe. Not a note. Not a trail. What the searchers did find, however, was something curious. Inside the church, just in front of the altar where Benjamin had likely been standing last, was a faint, chalk-drawn spiral. It was approximately 22 inches across. Delicately drawn. Clean, deliberate lines. At the time, no one thought much of it. The youth group had met earlier in the week, and some assumed it was part of a game or leftover from a children's craft. A janitor cleaned it up the next morning. But something about the spiral stayed in Sheriff Gaines' mind. He noted it in his report, though he made no theories. He marked it simply, spiral, chalk, approximate 2 feet, beneath altar. In the following days, the town slowly returned to normal. Benjamin's disappearance became a whisper, then a rumor, then a kind of accepted absence. People said he had run away, that he'd gone looking for his father's family in Ohio, that he'd gotten involved in something darker. But Lila never believed that. She insisted Benjamin would never have left her. She kept his room exactly as he left it. Every day for a year, she placed a candle in the window. What she didn't know, what no one in Harlan could have known, was that 89 days later, another spiral would appear. This time, in a cabin in Zanesville, Ohio. And another child would vanish. But before that, Benjamin's case would linger. It would become the quiet seed in a pattern of vanishing that would grow more intricate, more precise, more ritualistic. 3 weeks after Benjamin disappeared, Mrs. Kindle, the choir director, suffered what doctors called a nervous collapse. She had been seen pacing the halls of the school, muttering in Latin, a language she claimed not to know. She was admitted to the regional psychiatric hospital and later diagnosed with acute stress response. In one interview conducted by a local reporter, later buried in archives, she made a strange statement. They told him to sing in the spiral. I heard them. I heard the notes. It was a song I couldn't follow. The article was never published. That spring, strange occurrences were noted inside the church. The organ was heard playing late at night, though the building was locked and empty. A candle left near the altar was found burned down each morning. Once, a page from the hymnal was found torn and arranged in a circle on the floor. The choir was disbanded. In June, a maintenance worker discovered a small bundle behind the pulpit, a candle stub, a strip of cloth that matched Benjamin's choir robe, and a page from a Latin grammar book. It was wrapped in twine and placed in a tin box. Again, no one reported it. The box was thrown out. In late summer, a boy named Eric Mason, 14 years old, told his parents he'd seen Benjamin standing in the woods near the creek bed. He said Benjamin's face looked wrong and that he wasn't blinking. He said Benjamin pointed to the ground, then walked backwards into the trees. Eric's story was dismissed. His parents were told not to encourage fantasy. A week later, Eric was caught drawing spirals in his school notebooks. He said it helped him sleep. He later recanted everything. The Arnett home became a quiet place. Lila stopped going to church. She stopped speaking to most of the neighbors. Every few weeks, she called the sheriff to ask if anything had changed. It never had. Then, just before Christmas, she received a letter. It had no return address. It was postmarked from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Inside was a sheet of paper, no handwriting. Just a spiral, drawn in white chalk. She reported it to the police. But with no fingerprints, no handwriting, and no known link to the area, there was nothing to pursue. The case was quietly filed away as unsolved. Benjamin Arnett was officially listed as missing, presumed runaway. No one connected the spiral to anything. No one looked beyond Harlan. And then, in early June of 1972, in a different state, under different circumstances, a second teenager vanished, and another spiral was found. This time, someone paid attention, and the chalk spiral case would begin. The summer in Zanesville arrived heavy and wet. Heat stuck to the trees like tar, and thunderclouds hovered on the edge of the sky with a lazy menace. On the second Sunday of June, a youth retreat was underway at the St. Bridget's Spiritual Camp, a worn-down retreat ground nestled deep in the wooded outskirts of Muskingum County. The camp had once been a thriving center for summer theology programs in the 1950s. But by 1972, it had grown into something much smaller, quieter, and vaguely forgotten. Among the 24 campers that week was 14-year-old Deirdre Mullins. Deirdre was, by all accounts, an intelligent, introverted girl. A scholarship student from Columbus, she had a passion for religious history, a collection of antique rosaries, and a habit of copying long passages of scripture by hand into her journal. She had no siblings. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had died the previous year under mysterious circumstances. Her mother had sent her to St. Bridget's to get away from the city and clear her thoughts. On the evening of June 11th, Deirdre was seen exiting the mess hall alone shortly after supper. The sun was still above the trees. One of her counselors, Sister Marianne, remembered Deirdre asking if she could pray in the old chapel before lights out. Permission was granted. She was never seen again. That night, when bed checks were done at 10 p.m., her bunk was empty. At first, the assumption was that she'd fallen asleep in the chapel or wandered to the lake. The search began casually. By morning, it turned frantic. The old chapel at St. Bridget's was a crumbling, single-room wooden building with cracked floorboards and broken window panes. It hadn't been used officially in over a decade. Inside, the searchers found Deirdre's journal placed carefully on the altar. The last entry simply read, "They don't speak in words. They draw the song." Beneath the altar, someone had drawn a chalk spiral. This spiral was larger than the one in Kentucky, over 40 inches across. It had been drawn in overlapping layers, as if someone had retraced it dozens of times. There were no other marks. No footprints. No fingerprints. And no sign of Deirdre. Sheriff Lewis Tadd of Muskingum County was brought in. He photographed the scene and took statements from the staff and campers. The consensus was unanimous. No one had seen or heard anything. No one knew where she'd gone. There were no tire tracks near the edge of the property. No indication of an outsider. The chapel doors had been closed from the inside. And yet, Deirdre was gone. The photograph of the chalk spiral was passed around the sheriff's office. One deputy joked that it looked like the kind of nonsense you'd find in a hippie commune. Another said his daughter had drawn something similar during an art class. But Tad thought differently. Something about the symmetry, the tension in the lines. It looked like it had purpose. For weeks, flyers were distributed across the county. Interviews were conducted. A local psychic claimed she had seen a girl swallowed by a white shape in the woods. A traveling preacher said Deirdre had been taken as punishment for dabbling in the forbidden Latin rites. All of this made local headlines. None of it helped. On June 19th, Tad received a call from a man named James Holler, a private investigator from Kentucky. Holler had been following the case of Benjamin Arnett for personal reasons. He was distantly related to Benjamin's father. He had heard about the chalk spiral in Zanesville from a cousin who read the story in a local paper. Holler drove to Ohio the next day, spiral sketch in hand. When he compared the photographs, he saw it immediately. They were almost identical. The spiral beneath the altar at St. Bridget's matched the one found in Harlan Baptist Church to within a quarter inch. The curvature, the direction, the spacing, all of it matched. Tad didn't want to believe it. Two disappearances, separated by hundreds of miles, with nearly identical chalk spirals. But the facts were facts. He faxed the photos and documents to the FBI field office in Cincinnati. Days passed. No reply. 2 weeks later, a single envelope arrived. Inside was a letter, and signed, typed on plain paper. Thank you for your submission. This matter is being reviewed internally. There is no current link between the incidents. Do not pursue further at this time. That was it. Tad stored the materials in a locked drawer. Holler returned to Kentucky, and the case of Deirdre Mullins was officially deemed a missing persons case with no criminal elements. But there were more clues. Over the following month, counselors from St. Bridget's came forward with strange stories. Sister Marianne said she'd begun hearing music at night. Faint, indistinct hymns with no source. One camper reported seeing Deirdre standing in the woods days after the disappearance, but when he called out, she turned and walked backwards into the trees without making a sound. 3 campers began experiencing sleep paralysis. They described the same vision, lying in bed, unable to move, while a spiral of light slowly turned on the ceiling. Each time, the dream ended with a whisper in Latin. One of the boys, 12-year-old Liam Kessler, began drawing spirals obsessively. When asked why, he replied, "It's the shape they leave behind." When asked who they were, he said only, "They listen when we sing. They're always waiting." His parents pulled him from camp early. On July 6th, just after the 4th of July holiday, the camp director discovered a cassette tape placed in his office mailbox. There was no label, no handwriting. When played, it contained only static at first. Then, after 2 minutes, the sound of a girl humming emerged, soft, hesitant, like a lullaby learned in reverse. At exactly 3:33 into the recording, a deep voice interrupted. One word, spoken in Latin. Vocati. It means they are called. The rest of the tape was blank. It was never turned over to police. The camp director, fearing panic, burned the tape in a fireplace that evening. But the story spread. Campers whispered about the girl in the spiral. Parents stopped sending their children. By the end of July, St. Bridget's closed indefinitely. And still, no one knew what the spiral meant. Not yet. But it would be found again, 3 months later. In Bradford, Pennsylvania. Drawn under a pew. With Latin scrawled beside it. And the pattern continued to grow. It began with the smell of smoke. On the night of September 23rd, a small fire broke out in the rear choir room of St. Aloysius Catholic Church, a red brick structure nestled at the edge of the Allegheny Forest. The fire was quickly extinguished. There were no injuries, but the wooden pews were scorched and splintered, and a large portion of the back wall had been blackened. While inspecting the damage the next morning, maintenance worker John Killian made a strange discovery beneath the altar, a faint chalk spiral, partially obscured by soot and ash. Its edges extended just beneath a half-burned prayer rug. It wasn't until later that someone realized 16-year-old choir student Hannah Greaves had failed to return home the night before. Hannah was quiet, focused, and devout, known for her strict discipline and her voice, which had earned her a rare soloist position during Eastern Massachusetts. Her disappearance sent a ripple through the community. Church leaders urged calm. Police searched the surrounding forest and streets. But within 48 hours, there was still no trace. And then someone found the message. Inspiralis cantus. Vocem eram audiat. It had been written on the back of an old hymnal in faded ink. Translated, it read, "In the spiral, they sing. Their voices are heard." The handwriting did not match Hannah's, and the hymnal had come from a storage cabinet that hadn't been opened in decades. The police once again treated it as vandalism, teenage rebellion, a prank. But one person in town wasn't so sure. A high school Latin teacher named Catherine Shaw, who had been in the choir as a girl herself in the 1950s, contacted Sheriff Alan Dunmore directly. She told him she had seen something similar before. Years ago, she said, a different student had vanished under strange circumstances. Her name was Eleanor Pike. She had also sung in the choir. She had also been drawn to the chapel late at night. She had also been last seen during a week where strange Latin texts had surfaced around the church. The spiral, Shaw said, was the same. That report had been buried. There had been no internet in 1956. No easy way to link the case to others. No reason for national attention. But she remembered, because Eleanor had been her friend. When Shaw showed Dunmore a drawing she had kept in a notebook from 1956, a sketch of the spiral Eleanor had once drawn on a school desk, the sheriff's blood ran cold. It was identical to the chalk spiral found after Hannah's disappearance. Dunmore began cross-checking missing persons reports from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. Eventually, his search led him to the files on Benjamin Arnett and Deirdre Mullins. He sent copies of Hannah's case details to both Sheriff Tad in Ohio and the now-retired Sheriff Gaines in Kentucky. Both men responded within the week. The spirals were the same. And suddenly, 3 cases, previously unrelated, formed the first documented triad in what the FBI would later refer to, unofficially, as the chalk spiral sequence. But Bradford wasn't done giving up its secrets. 1 week after Hannah disappeared, the church received a manila envelope postmarked from Baltimore. Inside were 5 photographs. Each showed a blurry figure standing in a wooded clearing. The figure appeared to be wearing a choir robe. The robe looked singed at the hem. In the final photo, the figure's face was turned toward the camera. The face was blank, featureless, as if erased or never fully formed. The envelope contained no return address, no note, just a set of coordinates scribbled in blue ink on the back of the 5th photo. The coordinates pointed to a clearing in the forest just 2 miles west of the church. When authorities investigated, they found nothing. No robe, no footprints. But at the center of the clearing, drawn into the damp earth, was a spiral, over 4 feet across. The lines had been carved by hand. And in the center of the spiral, buried just beneath the soil, they found a small, tarnished crucifix engraved with the initials HG. It belonged to Hannah Greaves. From that moment forward, local authorities began to quietly suspect the disappearances were ritualistic. But without a suspect or physical evidence, they had nothing to pursue. No arrests were made. That fall, attendance at St. Aloysius plummeted. Rumors spread quickly. The church closed its choir program indefinitely. The priest who had overseen the last mass before the fire took a sudden leave of absence and never returned. Weeks later, someone painted a spiral on the door of his rectory. In white paint. The investigation stalled. But 2 patterns had now emerged. 1. Each victim was deeply involved in church choir or liturgical music. 2. Each spiral was drawn near or beneath a religious structure. The 3rd pattern, the most unsettling, was only beginning to emerge. The dreams. By October, 5 different residents in Bradford, none of them connected to the church, reported recurring nightmares. Each described being inside a stone chapel they had never seen before. The chapel contained no pews, only spirals carved into the floor. They said they heard voices. They said the voices were singing in Latin. And always, at the end of the dream, they saw a group of figures in robes standing in a circle. But the figures had no faces. The descriptions matched perfectly, down to the number of figures. 16. The FBI finally reopened the files in December. But by then, a 4th spiral had already been found, this time in Tennessee. And the chalk spiral case moved one step deeper into darkness. The cold settled early in Tennessee that year. By the first week of December, the woods around Tullahoma were stiff with frost. The sky hung low and colorless over the Cumberland Plateau. Pines and bare-limbed oaks loomed over every gravel path. In the stillness of winter, sound traveled farther than it should. At the edge of the Arnold Air Force Base perimeter sat the old Leighton Choir School, a three-building complex originally built in the 1930s to train choir directors for ecclesiastical settings. The school had long since ceased formal operations and had, by the early 70s, transformed into a kind of experimental musical retreat. A place for gifted teens to study advanced liturgical arrangement, Gregorian modes, and sacred harmonic structures. Funding came quietly from the Diocesan Fellowship of Sacred Arts. On December 2nd, the school welcomed its winter residency program, an intensive 2-week session for 7 students handpicked from parochial institutions across the South. One of them was 15-year-old Micah Bloom. Micah had come from Mobile, Alabama. He was a self-taught composer, known among church musicians for his uncanny ability to reconstruct medieval hymns by ear. Teachers described him as eerie, brilliant, and strangely distant. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He sometimes woke in the middle of the night humming harmonies no one could recognize. On December 5th, 3 days after arriving at Leighton, Micah vanished. His bunk was untouched. His robe still folded at the foot of the bed. His music folio was missing. At first, instructors assumed he'd walked into town. But by nightfall, when he failed to return, a search party was organized. They combed the surrounding forest. Snow had begun to fall in light flurries, dusting the underbrush. That's when they found the clearing. Roughly 500 yards behind the chapel dormitory, just beyond a thicket of frostbitten dogwood trees, a natural hollow opened up. At the center of it was a wide, carefully swept spiral etched into the dead grass. Surrounding it were fragments of music paper, some buried in the snow. The fragments were covered in handwritten notation. The notes formed no known melody. And in the center of the spiral was Micah's folio, open to a blank page. One page had writing, a single phrase in Latin. No light sequicantum. Do not follow the song. Law enforcement from Coffee County were called. A team arrived and cordoned off the area. A helicopter was used to scan the nearby woods. No heat signatures. No prints. Nothing. The next morning, December 6th, an instructor named David Rorick admitted he had seen Micah the night before, around midnight, walking barefoot along the eastern hallway, humming. Rorick hadn't stopped him, thinking perhaps Micah was sleepwalking. But what he recalled unsettled him. The song he hummed, it was echoing, like 2 voices singing from his mouth at once. The following day, 2 more students reported nightmares. Each claimed to see Micah standing inside a dark chapel, drawing a spiral on the stone floor with candle wax. In the dreams, Micah looked at them and mouthed a word neither could understand. One of the students, 16-year-old Luis Tavares, began having seizures. The attending doctor described them as tonic-clonic in structure, but strangely rhythmic. After regaining consciousness, Luis whispered, "They sing in corners. I heard them waiting." He was removed from the program and hospitalized. The Leighton Choir School suspended its winter session. All remaining students were sent home. But something had changed. Unlike previous spirals, this one included symbols, interwoven into the outer loops. Some resembled neumes, ancient medieval notations. Others were geometric, resembling sacred geometry diagrams. A musicologist from Vanderbilt, brought in by the sheriff's office, identified the markings as part of a theoretical system proposed by Renaissance occultist Athanasius Kircher, an early attempt to bridge musical intervals with angelic invocations. The theory was never fully proven, but the markings at Leighton mirrored his work almost exactly. For the first time, local law enforcement reached out directly to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. Special Agent Terrence Cale was assigned the case. Cale had reviewed the Kentucky, Ohio, and Pennsylvania cases, but had never expected a fourth. He drove to Tennessee himself. He examined the spiral, interviewed the staff, and took detailed photographs of the musical symbols. His preliminary report, later heavily redacted, made the following conclusions. 1. The incident mirrors a developing pattern across multiple states. 2. The symbols present at this site suggest an intentional composition of non-standard musical notation. 3. Psychological symptoms among students indicate a possible shared hallucination or mimetic effect. 4. Subject Micah Bloom may have been induced, coerced, or otherwise influenced to voluntarily enter the woods. Cale's unofficial notes, found decades later in a recovered journal, contained a more disturbing comment. They're not just taking them. They're being invited. Meanwhile, on the final night before the school was shut down for good, one instructor, Margaret Rollins, was awakened by music. She described it as a low, humming chord sustained across a 5-note interval. She followed the sound out of her dormitory and down the hall. On the far wall, drawn in ash and oil, was a spiral with 16 distinct segments. At the center was a handprint, too small to be an adult's. When she touched it, the humming stopped. And somewhere in the woods, something answered back. It was a Wednesday, one of those overcast New England days where color seems drained from everything. In the stone chapel of St. Erasmus Institute for Liturgical Music, a private boarding school nestled against the edge of the Quinnebog River, a choir rehearsal ended early when one of the students collapsed. Her name was Elena Drutt, 17 years old, top of her class, mezzo-soprano, a serious student, meticulous in everything she did. Elena had been composing a setting of the Requiem Mass for her senior thesis, a work that had already caught the attention of liturgical scholars in Boston. But in recent weeks, she'd grown quieter, withdrawn. Her roommates said she stayed up late, scribbling in the margins of old hymnals. She had started wearing earplugs at night. She said it helped keep the whispers out. The collapse happened during the Dies Irae section of rehearsal. Witnesses say Elena suddenly dropped her binder, covered her ears, and screamed. Not in pain, but in warning. It's breaking. The song is breaking. She was hospitalized immediately. A neurological scan revealed no trauma. But something was wrong. That night, she wrote a single sentence in her hospital notepad. There are voices in the intervals. The same night, in the basement of St. Erasmus's music library, another student named Paul Henderson found a chalk spiral drawn on the underside of a bench in the practice chamber. It had been traced repeatedly in pale blue chalk, almost invisible except under the light of a metronome lamp. At the spiral's center, a series of disjointed notes had been carved directly into the wood. They didn't form a melody, but when played, the notes created a strange, looping resonance, described by one instructor as sounding like a hymn that has forgotten how to end. That same week, 3 more students reported auditory hallucinations. One described hearing faint music during periods of silence. Another said he dreamed of a black room filled with pews made of salt. By the end of March, 5 students had dropped out of the institute. On April 3rd, Elena escaped from the hospital. Security footage showed her walking calmly out of the ward, barefoot and silent. She was last seen heading toward the riverbank just before sunrise. In the soft mud by the Quinnebog, a spiral had been etched with a stone. At its center, Elena's hospital bracelet. She was never found. The local police searched for weeks, dredged the river, tracked dogs through the woods. Nothing. Only rumors. A fisherman claimed to see her walking upstream in the fog, humming. A nun reported waking to find strange, sheet music nailed to her door. The institute shut its choir program down for the semester. Meanwhile, the FBI's behavioral science unit took notice again. Special Agent Cale, already neck-deep in the spiral phenomena, flew to Massachusetts. What he found disturbed him. The staff had collected notebooks from Elena's dorm, assuming they were harmless journals. But within the pages, Cale discovered hundreds of notated staves, almost all illegible, interlaced with Latin phrases and ink-blotted spirals. One phrase repeated dozens of times. In audita vocem. In hearing, a voice. Another simply read. Break the choir. Break the shape. Most chilling were the diagrams, choirs arranged in concentric circles, with annotations suggesting that the spacing of singers, if arranged in the wrong pattern, could generate dissonance so perfect it collapsed harmony altogether. Cale made a private note. What if the spiral isn't just a symbol? What if it's a tuning fork? Before he could investigate further, another report came in. This one from Louisiana. Another student. Another spiral. And this time, the music was still playing. It was the first Friday of May, and the choir at St. Clarissa's Conservatory for Sacred Music was rehearsing Psalm 16 for an upcoming diocesan competition. The chapel, built in the 1890s, echoed with chant tones that had been sung for more than a century. But this time, something was off. The recording equipment in the balcony began to glitch. Audio tapes played back with distortion, low, warbling interference that started during the final stanza. Preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust. The same phrase repeated, caught in a loop that hadn't existed in rehearsal. The technicians blamed faulty tape, But one of the instructors, Brother Jeremy Valles, said something else. It sounded like the chapel was singing back. The choir was led by 18-year-old Adrienne Delacroix. Born in Lafayette, she had been a musical prodigy since childhood. Her voice was noted for its clarity and range, and she'd recently been accepted into a competitive Catholic liturgy program in Rome. But Adrienne had been acting strange for weeks. She had begun composing new verses into existing psalms, altering endings, rewriting intervals. She said she was correcting the grammar of worship. She was particularly fixated on Psalm 16 and refused to explain why. 2 weeks before the performance, she delivered a new choral arrangement to Brother Valles. It was complex, dissonant, and unlike anything in the liturgical canon. The final measures included markings that no one recognized, dense geometric symbols woven into the staves. When asked about them, she simply said, "They were heard, not written." On May 4th, Adrienne failed to arrive for rehearsal. Her roommate found her bed untouched. Her rosary, snapped in two, lay beside a copy of Psalm 16 annotated with the phrase, "The body must stop where the voice begins." Police were contacted. A search was initiated. But by nightfall, they'd found nothing, until someone checked the chapel's subterranean furnace room. There, in the ash behind the furnace, they found a spiral drawn in melted wax. In its center, Adrienne's choir shoes. Investigators discovered an unlabeled reel-to-reel audio tape in the choir loft. It was unspooled and partially melted. What they recovered was 7 minutes of warped chant. At the 4-minute mark, Adrienne's voice emerged, humming a single pitch. Over it, a male voice recited Psalm 16 backward. A second tape, never recovered officially but rumored to exist, was said to contain another sound beneath the humming. The murmur of dozens of other voices, layered and out of sync, like choirs singing across time. After the disappearance, St. Clarissa's canceled its choral program indefinitely. The chapel was closed. But before it did, Brother Valles went through Adrienne's notes. He found hundreds of markings, notations in ancient Greek, Syriac, and fragments of Coptic hymns from desert monastic communities. Each was altered, revised to remove cadences or endings. She had not just been composing. She had been unfinishing music. Special Agent Cale arrived a week later, already on high alert. Baton Rouge was now the sixth site. His briefing memo included a new term, resonant recursion. It described a phenomenon in which tonal structures echoed through physical space. In some configurations, particularly spiral layouts of sound sources, they could create self-amplifying feedback loops, not of volume, but of meaning. Semantic collapse. Adrienne's annotations had pointed to this. So had Elena's in Massachusetts. In his private notes, Cale wrote, "The spiral is not a symbol. It's an architecture of collapse. A hymn with no end." That night, Valles admitted something else. He'd heard Adrienne singing beneath the chapel weeks earlier. He thought it was echo, but he was wrong. She was alone. Except she wasn't. When he approached, he saw figures standing behind the furnace, tall, indistinct silhouettes, draped in robes that shimmered like smoke. One turned. It had no face. And in his ears, Psalm 16 was being sung by 100 mouths. "Thou wilt not leave my soul in hell." He never entered the chapel again. By summer, the case files were growing. The spiral was no longer a fringe obsession. Within the Bureau, it was being treated as a pattern, coded with the name CA 16 after the psalm. It was beginning to be classified. But it wasn't done. Another spiral appeared in August. And this one spoke. The report was filed at 2:14 a.m. by Trooper Dennis Faulkner, who had pulled off Route 84 near Fishkill, New York, to respond to a distress call. A driver had reported hearing strange singing over the AM radio while parked near a decommissioned rest area. The caller's vehicle had gone dead. Faulkner arrived 20 minutes later. He found no car, but he did find something else. At the center of the abandoned rest area, barely visible in the overgrown asphalt, was a massive chalk spiral, nearly 12 feet in diameter, drawn with such precision that Faulkner at first mistook it for a surveyor's stencil. But there were no construction crews, no recent work orders, no chalk residue beyond the spiral. And then his radio began to hum. According to the incident transcript, Faulkner described the hum as tonal, like a tuning pitch, which was quickly overlaid by faint Latin chanting. He attempted to call dispatch, but the signal failed. What followed is only known through a partial recording recovered from the dash recorder. In the recording, Faulkner whispers, "There's something moving. I see. Ropes. At the tree line. God, I think they're singing. Static. Then, faintly. It's in my head now. The transmission ends. Faulkner was found at dawn, alone and unconscious in his cruiser. He had no memory of the night. But in the back seat, investigators found a portable cassette recorder with 37 minutes of audio, most of it unintelligible. Midway through, a voice, believed to be Faulkner's, recites Psalm 16. The same verse repeated endlessly. Preserve me, O God. In the final minute, another voice joins. Genderless, deep, and layered with distortion. A voice that did not belong to anyone present that night. The FBI intercepted the tape within hours. They had been monitoring transmissions since Baton Rouge. The moment the spiral's form was confirmed, Special Agent Cale dispatched a team. But the chalk spiral had already been destroyed by overnight rain. All that remained was a pattern of pooled water in its shape. Still, something lingered. The area surrounding the site exhibited strange effects. Birds refused to land on the asphalt. Several state troopers reported migraines while standing near the center of the spiral. And one, Officer Marlene Ortega, claimed to hear whispering when she turned her head too quickly. From the Fishkill incident forward, the Bureau began tracking reports of sound anomalies tied to spirals. What began as localized disappearances was now spreading into the electromagnetic field, a pattern of tonal broadcast. It became known inside the Bureau as event echo, a term used to describe recurring sonic manifestations occurring near spiral sites. Meanwhile, a group of amateur radio operators on the East Coast began logging what they called the hollow choir, a low-bandwidth signal that repeated every 2.16 hours across shortwave frequencies. The signal contained bursts of chant, occasional Latin phrases, and long gaps of silence punctuated by a strange choral click, as though someone were changing stations within a choir. In Buffalo, a radio technician claimed to hear his own voice layered into the signal, repeating a phrase he had never spoken. We must hold the spiral open. It is not done. The hollow choir signal was triangulated once to an empty field in the Catskills, where another chalk spiral was found. By now, Agent Cale was convinced the spirals were no longer just symbolic. They were antennas, and someone or something was listening. He made contact with a former acoustician-turned-occult scholar, Dr. Walter Hallberg, who presented a chilling hypothesis. Spirals, especially those composed with correct geometric and harmonic ratios, could act as phase portals. Resonance-based gateways not of space, but of awareness. Cale's notes from this meeting read, they're constructing a choir across state lines, not of voices, but of openings. Later that month, in a Bureau listening lab, one of the hollow choir tapes was run through spectral analysis. Beneath the chant, they discovered a hidden waveform mimicking the shape of a spiral when plotted visually. Sound made into shape. Shape made into voice. That voice was speaking. The Bureau's low-frequency surveillance grid, recently upgraded in coordination with Naval Research Lab Signals Intelligence, recorded an anomaly, an ultra-low frequency pulse that pinged off multiple atmospheric reflectors. It originated from nowhere. It repeated twice. Then silence. But it wasn't silent for long. By 4:22 a.m., 8 separate listening posts across the eastern seaboard reported a synchronized signal. Amateur radio operators picked it up first, a harmonic swell, chordal, almost choral, that shifted timbre every 88 seconds. The sound was immediately dubbed the response. Spectral analysis showed its shape, spiral. The Bureau's audio analysis division looped the signal through 3 different linguistic filters. In each one, buried beneath the lowest frequencies, was a phrase, distorted, slow, and spoken in Latin. Audite, revertimini, non est vox una. Listen, return. It is not one voice. At 5:03 a.m., Special Agent Cale convened a high-level task force in a soundproofed lab beneath Bureau HQ. The signal was isolated and transmitted to a custom analog audio array developed with assistance from Hallberg, now working full-time under contract. When run through his modified spiral phonograph, a device using vibration coils and pattern grooves rather than linear time, the message emerged not only audibly, but visually. A harmonic signature pulsed in spiral form on the screen. Cale stared at the waveforms. They bent and folded into each other, forming 16 concentric loops. 16, the same number as the robes in the first spiral, the same number as the voices reported in dreams. The same number etched into student notebooks, in pew arrangements, in the catacombs beneath St. Aloysius. But now they weren't just being seen. They were singing back. That night, 3 different bureau analysts suffered auditory hallucinations. One claimed to hear a girl's voice humming Psalm 16 in the concrete stairwell. Another had a nosebleed while reviewing the audio logs. A third went missing altogether. His security badge was later found in a storage closet marked for decommissioning. On the back wall, a chalk spiral. The bureau sealed the room, classified it, called it CA 16X. Kill wasn't sleeping anymore. His field notebooks had begun to fill with sketches he didn't remember drawing. Voice diagrams, choir layouts, sacred geometries woven with sound waves. Some matched Adrian Delacroix's notations. Others matched fragments from Elena Drutz's unfinished masses. It all pointed to one idea. The choir was building something. Across the country, things were stirring. In Fresno, a police radio dispatcher caught 16 seconds of choral chant before her headset exploded with static. In Baltimore, the bells of St. Alphonse rang out Psalm 16 unprompted, no one in the belfry. In Cincinnati, an entire convent lost consciousness during Vespers, claiming afterward they had been lifted into song. Each incident had 2 things in common. 1. A spiral found within 24 hours. 2. A voice heard speaking from nowhere, saying, Vox vocat vocem. A voice calls to a voice. Dr. Hallberg delivered a report warning of choral cascade, a theorized phenomenon in which a critical mass of interlinked sonic spirals could cause harmonic destabilization in conscious observers. In simple terms, if the spiral system sang long enough, reality might shift to match the choir. It would not be hallucination. It would be modulation. On October 28th, 10 days after the response, a church in Vermont caught fire during evening service. 17 people perished. In the ashes, the stone floor revealed a massive spiral, this one engraved into the foundation, centuries old. And at the center, untouched by fire, a choir folio. Inside were blank pages. Except one, scrawled in charcoal across a staff. Audite, cantate, sequamini. Listen, sing, follow. The choir had answered, not as saviors, not as spirits, as something older, something built not of flesh, but of form. And they were waiting to be heard. The St. Aloysius Academy for Liturgical Studies sat like a forgotten fortress on the southern edge of Baltimore's old industrial corridor. Its exterior, weather-worn brick and oxidized copper, bore the weight of almost a century. But it was what lay beneath the school that drew attention in early November. The catacombs. Originally constructed as a crypt and relic vault in the early 1900s, the catacombs beneath St. Aloysius stretched for nearly half a mile beneath the old chapel and performance halls. Used mostly for storage of archival sheet music, vestments, and instruments, it had fallen into disuse by the late 1960s. Only one key remained, and it was in the possession of choir director Father Raymond Delancey. On the morning of November 3rd, Father Delancey reported strange vibrations during rehearsal. Not audible tones, but felt like a low-frequency pressure building from below the choir loft. He dismissed it until later that day when one of the altos, 17-year-old Nora Vale, suffered a severe panic attack mid-psalm. When she was pulled aside, she whispered a single sentence before fainting. There's something singing under us. The next day, Delancey descended into the catacombs with the key and 2 students assisting with music archiving. Within 20 minutes, the 2 students fled in terror, claiming to have heard voices coming from the walls, humming tones that seemed to respond to footsteps. Delancey remained. He returned 2 hours later, pale and silent, carrying an old crate of reel-to-reel tapes marked Evox. The tapes bore no cataloging numbers. Most were dated between 1947 and 1952. Some were labeled simply with Latin phrases. Psalmus fractus. Voci mortua. Inspirali. Cale arrived within 36 hours of the discovery. The Bureau had been tracking St. Aloysius for months, ever since the bells rang out Psalm 16 without mechanical input. Hallberg arrived with him, now operating as a civilian contractor and harmonic analyst. Together, they oversaw the tape's playback on vintage analog equipment in the Academy's sealed rehearsal studio. The recordings were unlike anything previously encountered. Each tape opened with static, then resolved into overlapping vocal tones, many layered beyond the human range. Some matched no known language. Others contain fragments of known psalms, but restructured, reordered, inverted. Most unsettling were the responses. At seemingly random intervals, each tape featured moments where the choir's recording seemed to pause, and a voice answered back, low, gravelly, with a timbre not matching any known speaker. One exchange. Choir, tape 2 Deus solus. Response, unidentified, nonsum solus. You alone are God. / I am not alone. Hallberg charted the intervals between the responses. They formed a Fibonacci progression. By the fourth tape, something new emerged, a sonic structure, repetitive yet expanding. The music was spiraling. Cale's notes from that week become increasingly erratic. On November 6th, he sketched a diagram of the catacombs with vocal resonance markers, mapping each echo path to overlapping spiral vectors. His margin notes read, "They're rehearsing below us. But for what? And later. The building is not haunted. It is harmonic." Further investigation of the catacombs revealed scorched pews stacked in a half-circle, wood warped by fire yet never burned. Centered among them, embedded in the floor, was a bronze disc. When dusted, it revealed an etched spiral containing 16 cloaked figures engraved around its edge, each with their mouths open in song. No record of the disc's creation exists. Nora Vale, recovering in the school infirmary, was asked what she saw before fainting. She replied, "I saw mouths in the stone. Not faces, just mouths." She began humming a phrase she claimed she'd never learned, 4 notes, rising, then falling. When played back into the catacombs via a directional speaker, a second tone responded from the darkness. The frequency matched one found in the Baton Rouge transmission. On November 10th, the last tape, AVOX 16, was played. It opened with silence. Then a soft chord, perfect fifths layered in 4/4 time. The phrase repeated, growing more dissonant, as if something were being added each cycle. At the 10-minute mark, a male voice entered, whispering in Latin, "Sequentia est fractio. Cantus est via. Sequence is fracture. Song is the way." Then a final sound. A chord, impossible mathematically. Hallberg collapsed. His ears bled. The tape disintegrated in the machine. Cale's final report from St. Aloysius was filed 3 days later. It ended with a chilling conclusion. The choir is not a group. It is a condition. And we are already singing. The data had outgrown the file cabinets. By mid-November, the Bureau had accumulated 216 separate incident reports under the CA-16 designation, spread across 14 states. Each case file was increasingly nonlinear, filled with spiral diagrams, contradictory witness testimonies, malformed audio logs, and inexplicable harmonic resonance anomalies. Even the filing clerks began to complain. Pages would go missing, then reappear in different order. Tapes would distort when left unattended. Special Agent Cale authorized a reorganization under Project Echo Liturgy. The first task was the creation of what they called the Spiral Index, an attempt to catalog, cross-reference, and identify patterns in the now sprawling case. It was overseen by analyst Vera Sontag, a former linguistics researcher who had previously worked on cryptographic analysis during the Cold War. Sontag approached the task not as a crime analyst, but as a semiotician. She believed the choir wasn't communicating randomly. It was composing. By November 19th, Sontag had identified 16 distinct motif clusters across all incident sites. 1. Spiral geometry drawn or etched into physical surfaces. 2. Presence of altered sacred music, especially psalms. 3. Vocal hallucinations during silence. 4. Disappearance of individuals after auditory episodes. 5. Chalk markings, always blue or white. 6. Sudden transmission of Latin phrases over analog systems. 7. Engagement with Psalm 16 or its melodic components. 8. Temperature drop localized to spiral centers. 9. Reports of time dilation or memory loss. 10. Impossible choral harmonies emerging from empty rooms. 11. Bells ringing without mechanical cause. 12. Formation of concentric or choir-based spatial arrangements. 13. Presence of faceless or indistinct robed figures. 14. Discovery of blank sheet music with anomalous annotations. 15. Reverse or fractal waveform patterns in audio files. 16. 16 recurring voices or figures, always present. Cale and Sontag noticed a hidden structure. When mapped across dates and geography, these motif clusters formed their own spiral, with each site acting as a node on an invisible staff. like notes. Hallberg reviewed the mapped index and wept. He believed he could now predict the next site. Using reverse triangulation of the hollow choir's signal decay, Sontag proposed a pattern that would place the next event in Ely, Nevada, a near-deserted town with a decommissioned Catholic seminary known as St. Lactatius. A team was deployed. They found the seminary abandoned. Dust, cobwebs, evidence of vandalism. But in the former chapel, under the faded mural of St. Cecilia, was a new spiral, not chalk, but carved directly into the stone floor. At its center, a chair, draped in a black robe. An analog reel sat beside it. No markings. When played back at low speed, the audio revealed a whisper. Index complete. Score awaits. That night, Agent Cale sent a message to the director. Subject, CA, 16 escalation. Status, active composition. Threat level, semiotic. Priority shift, from containment to translation. He now believed the spiral was not a series of events. It was a single act unfolding. A hymn with 16 verses. Each case wasn't a mystery. It was a stanza, and there were more to come. In the following days, the spiral index would begin to shift on its own. New entries appeared, ones no one recalled filing. Tapes replayed with added voices. The 16 cloaked figures began appearing in sketches from agents across departments, drawn absent-mindedly in margins, napkins, notebooks. Sontag discovered a page added to the spiral index with her own handwriting. Sing the silence. Score the air. Await the fall of the 16th. She had no memory of writing it. Hallberg believed this was confirmation. Not that the choir was composing, but that it had begun rehearsals. The church had no name. Locals simply called it the Chapel on the Hollow, a brick husk nestled at the bottom of a shale ravine just east of Steubenville's long-abandoned steel yards. Official records listed no ownership. The structure was never formally consecrated. Yet it had stood there since at least 1904, judging by the cracked limestone cornerstones and weathered stained glass depicting unknown saints, none of whom bore names or faces. It was here that the 11th spiral was found. Discovered by accident on the morning of December 1st, the site was reported by an amateur photographer who had ventured into the chapel during a light snow. He never explained why he went inside. His photos, developed the following day, showed something no one could immediately process. 16 black choir robes folded neatly in a circle, surrounding a spiral of scorched pew fragments and melted hymnals. Behind them, on the altar wall, the mural of a faceless figure with its arms outstretched. Its hands held a scroll, and on that scroll was written, Cantate nihilum. Sing nothing. When federal agents arrived, they found the photographer gone. All that remained was his camera, still clicking. Inside the film compartment, blank negatives. As if the chapel had consumed the image. Cale was in transit from Quantico within hours. Hallberg joined him. So did Sontag. Inside the chapel, they found something that hadn't appeared in the photographs. A pulpit had been dragged into the spiral. On it, a tape deck, already playing. The sound was absence. Not static, not hum. A kind of sonic vacuum. But through it, at irregular intervals, emerged a breath sharp, hollow, inhaled but never exhaled. Like a reverse chant. They called it the inhalation liturgy. That night, Sontag wandered outside the chapel and collapsed. She claimed she heard someone calling her name, but not in a voice, rather, in a memory. As if her own recollection had been altered to insert an unfamiliar tone. She described dreaming of a mass being conducted with no sound. The congregants stood motionless, mouths sewn shut, hands held in supplication. Each one bore the spiral etched onto their palms. One by one, they turned toward her. Their stitched mouths opened, and she heard singing. Back inside, Cale and Hallberg found a trapdoor beneath the altar. Behind it, a narrow stone stairwell descending into what appeared to be an ossuary. But the walls weren't stacked with skulls. They were carved with mouths. Dozens of them, open, toothless, some with tongues protruding, all rendered in exquisite, grotesque detail. As they descended, the air thickened. The sound deepened. The recording device captured a frequency shift at 112 Hz, matching the core harmonic from Baton Rouge and St. Aloysius. The further they walked, the more distinct the pattern became, a chant with no source. Cale began humming. Hallberg followed. Neither realized they were doing it. The spiral, it seemed, could now use memory as an instrument. In the deepest chamber, they found an altar. Its surface, blank sheet music. At first glance, it appeared empty. But when viewed under ultraviolet light, a melody emerged, fragmented, unresolved. 16 measures. The final one torn. A phrase accompanied it. Inner non oris. In the mouth, not of the mouth. Hallberg broke down. He claimed the choir was no longer rehearsing. It was feeding. That night, the chapel burned. No ignition source was found. No lightning. No accelerants. And yet, by morning, only scorched stone remained. In the ashes, they found melted audio tape fused into the shape of a spiral. And nearby, in the snow, footprints leading into the woods. 16 sets. No sets returned. Cale's final note from Steubenville read, "The choir sings without mouths. It uses ours. The liturgy is not what is heard. It is what cannot be unheard." By early December, the Bureau's Science Division, already stretched thin by the psycholinguistic fallout from the Spiral Index, convened a multi-agency summit. It included representatives from the Naval Research Lab, MIT Psychoacoustics team, and several covert specialists from Cold War acoustic warfare programs. The goal: develop a working model of what the spiral actually was. They called it cold choir theory. The term originated from a memo drafted by Dr. Hallberg after the Steubenville incident. In it, he proposed that the choir was not a group of sentient entities, nor even a single phenomenon, but a distributed acoustic intelligence, one capable of self-replication, evolution, and mnemonic infection. The choir didn't sing. It seeded song. And the spiral wasn't just a symbol. It was a score. Using the data compiled in the Spiral Index, Sontag and Hallberg mapped harmonic overlaps between incident sites. These weren't just tonal. Some involved specific waveform interference patterns that recurred across thousands of miles. When synchronized on analog decks, certain samples formed constructive interference notes. When played in reverse, these nodes generated voices. The same 16. Voices that knew names, passwords, phrases from lost languages. Voices that could mimic loved ones. Voices that inserted themselves into bureau dreams, especially during sleep deprivation cycles. One analyst scratched a spiral into the soundproof booth wall before collapsing from cranial hemorrhage. Sunday, December 9th, a test was conducted in the underground sound chamber at Quantico. Hallberg arranged 16 reel-to-reel players in a radial formation and fed each one a separate field recording pulled from Baton Rouge, St. Aloysius, the Vermont Folio, and now Steubenville. The synchronized playback lasted only 88 seconds. All power in the sub-basement died. When it returned, 3 tapes had merged without mechanical contact. The new audio, labeled Choral Vector 3A, played a complete 16-part harmony of Psalm 16, inverted, reversed, and layered. Beneath it, a woman's voice whispered in English. "You must unhear the key." The room's temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Condensation formed a spiral on the glass. The following day, Sontag called for a re-evaluation of the threat. This is not an outbreak. It's a ritual structure evolving. The choir doesn't move through space. It unfolds through cognition. Wherever it is heard, it lives. This new definition led to internal panic. If the choir existed not as an external presence, but as a mnemonic algorithm, it could not be stopped through physical containment. It was acoustic contagion, a liturgy designed to install itself into memory and replicate through language, architecture, music, and ritual gesture. The Bureau ordered a total lockdown of all CA-16 materials. Audio files were transferred to lead-shielded analog vaults. All agents involved in prior sites were placed under neurological observation. And yet, the files continued to change. Transcripts began rewriting themselves. Musical notations reappeared on blank staves. Blank cassettes produced whispered prayers. One reel, left unmarked in Hallberg's lab, played a new phrase. Frost remembers what fire forgets. That same day, frost formed in the corners of the Bureau Chapel, despite no recorded drop in ambient temperature. Cale's own health began to decline. Migraines, audio hallucinations, sleep disturbances. He sketched spirals onto everything. Folders, mirrors, even his own wrist. In a late-night recording, he dictated a message not meant for any human ear. "We are not investigating an event. We are inside of him." And every verse has already been written. Hallberg's last memo that week included the final iteration of cold choir theory. The choir is recursive intention, sound folded through time. Its verses are memory. Its melody is architecture. Its harmony is contagion. The spiral is not a warning. It is a clef. And below that, scratched in the corner in red ink, the 16th will sing back. It was supposed to be a controlled site. Black Hollow, originally flagged during the Appalachian Signal Sweep of '72, was isolated, high in the Monongahela, with a population of less than 40. No church, no post office, no running water. Just a mining settlement that never recovered from the collapse of '58. And yet it had been circled in red on the spiral index for weeks. Something had been singing there since November. Something no one could trace. Hallberg insisted they send a limited recon team, analog only. No digital equipment. No radios. Everything recorded to reel or not at all. Cale objected, but he was overruled. The choir had reached critical mass. So they sent 2 agents, 1 bureau linguist, and a sound technician from the Navy. They never sent a return signal. The village was discovered on December 14th by a bureau follow-up team. Every home was empty. Chairs still warm. Meals left half-eaten. Doors ajar. But not a single body. In the old mining lodge at the center of town, they found 16 chairs arranged in a circle, each draped with a black robe. Beneath them, hymnals, charred, pages melted together, still radiating heat. But most chilling was what they heard next. The sound system, long since disconnected, began to play. It was not a song. It was a silence being shaped, like listening to the echo of a cathedral that was never built. Every agent heard something different. Some claimed the voices were speaking to them by name. Others heard messages in dead languages. One collapsed and had to be medevaced. He reported hearing the prayer from the other side. Cale arrived on December 15th. He ordered a full blackout. No one in, no one out. Every piece of analog equipment to be sealed. And still, the choir sang. Only now, it came from inside the mountains. That night, Sontag found something beneath the snow, a trail of hymnals leading to a collapsed mine shaft. The books were dry despite the blizzard. Each opened to Psalm 16. Hallberg insisted on following it. They descended with 2 recorders and lanterns. What they found was impossible. The mine opened into a vast, cathedral-shaped cavern. Not carved. Not mined. Formed. The walls pulsed with sound, ultrasonic, arrhythmic, yet undeniably melodic. Like the earth itself was breathing in polyphony. 16 alcoves lined the chamber, each containing a faceless statue robed in black, mouths open in mid-chant. A spiral was etched into the stone beneath their feet. Not chalk. Not ash. Glass. When stepped upon, it resonated. Each step formed a note. Hallberg called it the floor hymn. As they walked, the cavern began to sing back. The team was recovered 36 hours later. They had no memory of leaving. All recorders blank. Sontag's left palm bore a burn in the shape of a clef. Hallberg spoke a phrase in Akkadian before collapsing. The hymn was never for us. It was through us. And then, radio silence. Quantico lost contact with Black Hollow. When the next team arrived, the village was gone. Flattened. No fire. No collapse. Just an absence. Like the hymn had finished. And taken its choir with it. Cale's final report from the incident read, "We are beyond audit." Hymnal Black was not a sight. It was a crescendo. Every spiral is a measure. Every voice an instrument. There are 16 verses. The song is halfway sung. There is no official chapter 14 in the Bureau files. The documents pertaining to the days between December 20th and 25th, 1973, were sealed under an internal black code designation, Psalm null. Unauthorized duplication was punishable by federal indictment. Internal memos reference this window only as the convergence event. What follows was reconstructed through witness statements, journal entries, and recovered transcription fragments pulled from malfunctioning analog equipment inside Bureau HQ. December 20th. Cale returned to Quantico without Sontag or Hallberg. He spoke to no one. He was seen standing in the Bureau chapel for 5 hours straight, facing the stained glass window of St. Cecilia, the patroness of music. At 4:33 a.m., the glass shattered inward without contact. There was no wind, no vibration, just a fracture in silence. A technician later reported that the rupture registered as a sonic implosion. Not sound moving out, but folding in. At the same time, across 16 different locations, private homes, field offices, sound labs, Bureau agents independently recorded the same phenomenon. A black-robed figure standing outside. Faceless. Silent. Each disappeared when approached. December 21st. Audio recorders began activating on their own. Even ones without power. Even sealed units. Each one captured the same phrase. The choir arrives by breath. Hallberg was found in a soundproof room, unconscious but unharmed. Scribbled on the wall in what appeared to be chalk dust was a sequence of reversed musical notation. Sontag's whereabouts remained unknown. Cale issued a private bulletin marked etched. Do not listen to unattended recordings. Do not respond to your name in echo. If the choir asks you to sing, do not answer. December 22nd. The Bureau Chapel organ played itself. The melody was a known inversion of Psalm 16, matching Vector 3a from chapter 12. Agents described an unbearable pressure in their ears, some bleeding, some entering fugue states. One broke down and recited, in Latin, a wedding vow to an unnamed entity, swearing eternal silence in exchange for harmonic clarity. She has not spoken since. December 23rd. Reports of mirror spirals began to circulate. Not symbols, but spirals that reflected only in glass. They appeared in restrooms, windshields, surveillance panels. Each one began to rotate slowly when stared at. An agent attempted to touch the reflection. His hand did not return. The mirror showed a hand still reaching, palm marked with a clef. December 24th. Every radio on the Bureau's restricted frequency transmitted a single choral phrase, layered 16-fold. The mouthless liturgy begins. The sound carried no digital signature. But when isolated spectrographically, the waveform revealed an image. A spiral. Each line made of smaller phrases. We sang you into breath. The silence is our throat. 16 converge. 1 descends. Bureau Director Lansing issued an emergency broadcast to all operatives. If you hear the choir, record nothing. Respond to nothing. The spiral is now reactive. The 16th measure is imminent. December 25th. No official transmissions. Only silence. But in the analog vault, the lights flickered. Then rose. Inside, a single black robe. Folded. On top of it, a hymnal. Open to a final page. A melody without notation. Just the words. To listen is to belong. Cale was never seen again. Hallberg was institutionalized. Sontag was found on the steps of the St. Aloysius ruins, humming a tune that matched none ever recorded. She had no memory of where she had been. She only said, "It's begun." There is no return address on the final file. It arrived in a weathered manila envelope, unmarked, placed directly on the desk of the acting director sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. on December 31st. No one saw it delivered. No footage exists. The security logs for that night are corrupted. Inside the envelope, a reel of analog tape, a black and white photograph of a spiral drawn in ash, and a page of transcribed dialogue. At the top, written in pen. The 16th has sung. The recording, now archived as CA-16, final, is roughly 43 minutes long. It begins with silence. Not analog hiss. Not dead air. Actual silence and audio vacuum. Frequencies below the floor of human perception. The waveform is a flat line. But when played through analog systems, listeners describe hearing a breath. Then slowly, sound begins to emerge. First, a single chime. A bell rung once. Then, 16 voices. They enter in unison, not harmony, but something deeper. Something prior to music. The voices speak, but the words change depending on who listens. Transcripts from 5 separate analysts show different interpretations. Some heard scripture, others warnings, some a lullaby. One heard their own name, repeated over and over until it vanished. At 16:16, the recording ruptures. The tape twists, knots, then resumes. This time, only one voice remains. It calls itself the 16th. I am the final chord, the one that bends the stave. You counted the measures. You indexed the score. But you forgot the silence between. I am what sings there. I do not end the song. I close it. The waveform shows a spike, one not tied to sound, but light. Labs recorded photonic interference on playback. In analog, which should be impossible. At 37:00, the tape emits a harmonic surge so complex it collapses one of the lab's magnetic coil readers. The lights flicker. When they return, the lab is empty, except for the tape. Still turning. The photo. The black and white image shows a field of ash in a circular pattern. 16 robes lie in a spiral formation. At the center, an empty podium. On it, a conductor's baton, charred, split, pointing skyward. Beneath the image is a Latin inscription. Finus est aurora. The end is dawn. Analysts determined the photo was taken from at least 40 feet above ground, but no drone or aircraft was dispatched. The angle remains unexplained. Satellite records show a blackout over West Virginia for 22 minutes during the early morning hours of December 31st. No official correlation was made. The transcript page contains only the following, handwritten in a looping hand that does not match Cale, Hallberg, or Sontag. You cataloged the echoes. You named the silence. You tried to outsing the spiral. But there is only one ending. It is sung by all. And it sings you back. No signature. Just a clef symbol, drawn in ink and then scratched out. After this, the Bureau shut down Project Echo Liturgy. All files sealed. All names redacted. All agents reassigned or disappeared. Sontag left no forwarding address. Hallberg died in confinement 2 years later, reportedly humming a melody no one could transcribe. And Cale? No official record. Only a rumor that he was seen outside an abandoned chapel in Maine, sitting beneath a cracked stained glass window, tapping his fingers in 4/4 time. Listening. Waiting. The spiral was not solved. It was sung. And the 16th measure was never meant to end.